Hello, and welcome to Time Trek. In today's episode, we're going to be doing a tier list, ranking some historical eras by my own personal knowledge and understanding of each subject, but also by how interesting I find each historical era. Often we break down history into bite-sized chunks, like World War One, World War Two, but of course, each historical era is informed by the era that came before it. Where would you start a World War Two history podcast? You could start it in World War One because a lot of what happened in World War Two was informed by World War One. But of course, we like to break down and categorize these historical eras into nice little bite-sized chunks for us to watch for documentary purposes, reading for books, and that kind of thing. So, of course, certain historical eras get much more of a limelight in terms of the general public and in terms of an academic sense. I spent my time at university studying a lot more of the modern era, modern political history, American and European, British political history in the 20th century. I also did a lot of European medieval history, but I didn't, for example, study much African history. So even in an academic sense, certain eras and places of history are much more well focused on than others. But let's just begin and start talking about these particular historical eras and giving them a little bit of ranking and context. So I guess we'll start at the biggies, the ones that people talk about a lot. I will talk about World War Two. We'll jump straight in with World War Two. Now, of course, World War Two is probably the most documented, talked about period in all of human history. It is an immensely fascinating period in human history, an immensely tragic period in human history. Obviously, it's the largest war in terms of human history, in terms of the absolute death total that it inflicted. And of course, World War Two informs a lot of the world that we live in now, in terms of America becoming the world power after World War Two, in terms of the economic world order that we have now. A lot of that was informed by what happened in World War Two. In terms of the people, characters, I mean, we're talking about Adolf Hitler, Churchill, Stalin. These are names that echo throughout history for an obvious reason. These are interesting character studies of people in human history, and you could write entire novels, and people have wrote entire novels, books about just them characters alone. I believe Churchill might even be the most biographed person in all of human history. So, I mean, World War Two, where obviously this is going high. We'll just put that straight up there. World War One, I think that's a good place to go straight after World War Two. World War One, I would say, if anything, is even more important than World War Two because a lot of what happened in World War Two was because of World War One, was because of the Great War, the war to end all wars. The more I look into World War One and the more I'd say in general I have much more knowledge of World War Two, but I find World War One almost more fascinating because in World War One there is no clear good guy, bad guy like there is in World War Two, with obviously the Nazis being quite obviously the bad guys and the Democratic Allied nations. Let's just forget about Stalin being an ally for a second. The Democratic Allied nations obviously being the good guys in World War Two. So in that sense, as I say, the more I look and understand, and obviously I know quite a bit about I know a lot about World War One, but I'd never say I'm an expert in World War One. In terms of the idea of the war, I'd say like World War One was the worst war to be a soldier in. Absolutely, the conditions that the soldiers had to suffer in World War One is barbaric, to say the least. I remember reading records of the being so many flies on the inside the trench warfare system that they had, that the wall was practically like a wall of flies. The food was apocalyptically awful. This is also the first war that introduced the idea of shell shock, or what we probably today call PTSD. That's because of what the soldiers had to endure in terms of the immediacy of the war, but the shelling as well, the constant bombardment. In the movies, it's always shown as like but it was actually much more like it was very. It wasn't the slow that's portrayed in the movie. These shells were obliterating the trenches before the soldiers would have to go over the top. So, as I say, the more I learn about World War One, the more I look into World War One. It's just even more fascinating to me than World War Two. So it goes above World War Two, but it's still a very high. It goes into the top category for me. Then I guess we'll go to something a little bit more on the opposite end of the scale. We'll have a look at the Stone Age, where it all began, where human history began. You hear the Stone Age, it's broken down into the Neolithic, Mesolithic, and Paleolithic. That just means new, middle, and old Stone Age. Obviously, the longest period in all of all these periods, I believe the Stone Age began maybe 300,000 years ago when we started making tools. Anatomically correct so humans like us, humans genetically exactly the same as us, they probably turned up around 250,000 years ago. But there was clearly something that happened around 75,000 years ago, which was a leap forward in terms of technological advancement in humanity and thinking about more intellectual concepts and ideas of gods and that kind of thing that made us perhaps something happen around 70,000, 5,000 years ago. And obviously then you get the Lascaux cave paintings in France. Absolutely fascinating. But I'm going to throw in a big thing. I'd say the Stone Age is more of it's a very different study of history if you're used to studying medieval history, any other period of history, because the Stone Age, there's obviously no writing. It's pre-writing, it's pre-agriculture, it's pre a lot of things. So it's a much more scientific basis of how you're gathering your evidence. You're looking at a lot of archaeological stuff. In a way, the vast majority of what Stone Age history is forever lost because we don't have the written record of how these people thought about the world. We can interpret and extrapolate a lot of things, but it is just interpreting and extrapolating from what they've left behind. Incredibly fascinating period of history, but I'd just say it's a very hard period of history to become an expert in, and it's not something that I would want to become an expert in. But I think any historian who wants to have some basic, you've got to have some knowledge and basic understanding of what happened in the Stone Age, how we became more larger hunter-gathering bands, then we developed more complicated tools, and then eventually we invented agriculture. I think that's a basis that every historian should know as a basis, but in terms of the finer details and the scientific evidence, it's just you're going to be putting in a lot of effort to get very little reward, it feels for me, because of just, again, the fact there's no written record. So for me, that's why the Stone Age is going to be the first that's not going to be making the top tier. I'm going to be putting it in, I guess, the C tier or mediocre interest in this tier list. So then I guess we'll go in a little bit of a kind of a chronological order. So let's have a look what comes next. We've got the late Bronze Age, middle Bronze Age, broken up. We've got it. Ah, yes, we've got the early Bronze Age. So I guess yep, we'll start at the early Bronze Age coming up next. That's from 4000 to 2500 BCE. Obviously, this is the period when we have the first city-states, the first empires, the first writing language, society. This is when the pyramids would have been being built, obviously. This is when a lot of them ancient civilizations that we know of, so the Egyptians, the Indus River Valley civilization, and then, of course, Mesopotamia, which is where that was the center and cultural economic power of the world at that point. Obviously, we have stories about the Garden of Eden. Probably if there was a Garden of Eden, it would have been in ancient Mesopotamian kingdom or empire. You get the first law codes, basically this is the first when you get a lot of the firsts. What I would say again about this period, it kind of suffers the further you go back in time, the harder it is to find things and find because of just time erodes everything, unfortunately. So it's very hard to find these things. I mean, we kind of looked out with the ancient Mesopotamians because they wrote in cuneiform on clay tablets, so a lot of that stuff survives. But obviously, the Egyptians and other empires that were writing on different, that's just lost a lot of that. I'd say the early Bronze Age, I'd put it in a very similar category to the Stone Age. If anything, I'd put it slightly behind the Stone Age. Again, a lot of fascinating stuff going on, but not quite, we're not at the Roman Empire level of interest here, in my opinion. And again, this is all just how I interpret these periods of history. We'll go to the Middle Bronze Age next. That's probably going to be very similar to me. So we're going to around 1500 BCE. So that would be around 3,500 years ago. So we're approaching the Middle Kingdom, Egypt. Ancient China's well underway by this point. Don't know if the Indus River Valley civilization is still going. Obviously, they get invaded by Indo-Iranian peoples. We would have had the domestication of horses, Indo-European invasions, the Hittite kingdoms, that kind of stuff going on. But again, I think the Middle Bronze Age, it suffers again from the ravages of time and history. It's just so long ago. There's not a lot left. What is left is fascinating to a degree, but I can't really put it much higher than that at the moment. And I'd say the same with the late Bronze Age. I'd probably put the late Bronze Age in similar circumstance. In fact, I might put the late Bronze Age higher because we have the Bronze Age collapse, which is a very interesting period of history. That's when the late Bronze Age collapsed, which happened in around 1100 BC, 1177, I believe is the year the world ended in one famous book. But you had the complete collapse of the Hittite kingdom, the Mycenaean kingdom, which was the ancient kind of Proto-Greeks. Then you had the Ugaritic kingdom, lots of Levant kingdoms around the present day Middle East just completely obliterated, completely collapsed. You had Ramesses III, I believe. He just manages to keep Egypt going, but ancient Egypt from this point onwards, after the late Bronze Age collapse, is just on a trajectory downhill. In my opinion, I don't think that they never really get back to that height of Ramesses II, which was, in my opinion, the height of Egyptian power. So yeah, I'd put the late Bronze Age slightly higher than other periods of the Bronze Age. And then we get the Iron Age. Now the Iron Age, we've got dates 1100 to 600 BCE. Now iron was much more ubiquitous metal. It's a much easier metal to find and make than bronze. The only reason iron was probably not done earlier is because you have to smelt it at very, very, very high temperatures. I think around 1300 degrees Celsius. So to get to that temperature, you need furnace. So you need to develop furnace technology so you can actually reach them really, really high temperatures to smelt the metal. Bronze was a much easier metal to smelt. You could just smelt it over open flame and you just needed a bit of tin and copper, I believe, to smelt and create bronze. But the tin was very, very hard to find in the Bronze Age, so it created some really good trading networks. But you didn't need any of that for iron because iron you could just find anywhere. I guess the Iron Age, we get a lot of the beginnings of these famous, the Roman Empire is founded in the Iron Age, Romulus and Remus, around 700 BC. So we get some interesting stuff beginning to happen. I guess it's after the Bronze Age collapse, it's that beginning of the classical world that we'd come and know to love, which is coming up next. So I'm going to quickly rank the Iron Age. I'd probably put the Iron Age even lower. I'm going to be brutal. I'm going to have to put some stuff really low. I can't just put everything in the S tier, the top tier. So I'm going to be really, really brutal. Please tell me why I'm wrong and why the Iron Age was amazing. I'm probably missing quite a lot of stuff. But now we're on to the good, well, it might be the most interesting and fascinating empire in all of human history. It's the Roman Empire. It's number one so far for me of these periods in human history that we're studying. We've got probably some of the most famous names in all of human history: Julius Caesar, Augustus, even Caligula, some of the early emperors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. We've got the Trajan Heights and the Five Good Emperors and the Pax Romana, the Golden Age of Rome, and then we've got that being thrown away by Joaquin Phoenix in The Gladiator. That's a historically accurate film, completely accurate, obviously. I'm just kidding. Commodus, obviously, he was it famously he got an empire of gold and marble, and he turned it into an empire of rust or something. It's the quote. And then we get the crisis of the third century. Just before the crisis of the third century, we had one of my all-time favorite emperors, who was just an evil, evil man who dressed in a cape and went around murdering hundreds of thousands of people who didn't agree with him. So make a good villain in a good movie. Well, I don't know why we haven't had a Caracalla movie. Give me a Caracalla movie, please. And then we had the crisis of the third century. Aurelian, who's probably my all-time favorite emperor, came from very humble, basically nothing, like peasant, and then rose his way all the way to being the emperor. You had a few emperors that actually came from basically nothing, basically abject poverty, and just rose to become the emperor. And then after the crisis of the third century, we get Diocletian, who splits the empire, and then of course we get Constantine the Great, who introduces Christianity, and probably without Constantine the Great, we wouldn't have had the modern Christian world that we then had for the next 2,000 years. The influence and prestige of Rome is just it's unquestionable. Like, if anything, I'm confused as to why the History Channel focuses a lot more on World War II, and why documentaries they're really just about the Roman Empire. They tend to focus on the Judeo-Claudian dynasty, and I get that because that's the period when we went from the Republic to the Empire, and it's that pivot change, that moment when it changed under Caesar and Augustus, and that is a very interesting period of history. But there's countless other fascinating emperors that deserve just as much attention, in my opinion. So yeah, Rome's elite. Rome is Rome. So Rome goes to the top so far, but will anything top it? I don't know. Let's find out. Oh, whoopsie, we accidentally forgot classical Greece, the classical Greek age. So I'm going to put that one in, and then we're going to go into the Middle Ages. So the classical Greek stuff, I'm going to be really, really controversial here, and I'm going to say, okay, you got the ancient philosophers and the Athenian school, Plato, the ancient literary writers like Sophocles, and a lot of Western traditions. They all come back from Greece, that and the founding of democracy. Many of our modern words, music, for instance, comes from the Greeks. But apart from like Alexander the Great, and then that period just before when it was the golden age of Athens and the Athenian school, the rest of it I can leave. Like, it's not as fascinating for me because most of Greece never had that large empire and large, but they had the cultural empire and cultural export that obviously Rome took masses and masses from ancient Greece as well. There's some good highlights, in my opinion. You've got the Alexander the Great, the Athenian school, but the rest of it just a bit messy, a bit boring, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, probably. We're really, really controversial. I'm going to put that in front of the Iron Age. I'll put it in front of the Iron Age. In fact, I'll put it in front of I'll put it in front of the early and middle Bronze Age, and we'll put it just behind the late Bronze Age collapse. The dates they've given there is a 400-year period, but for me, it's like 150, 200 years. I mean, you do have the Ptolemaic Empire established over Egypt, so you have a Greek conquest of Egypt in that sense, and that lasts a good long while. But to say, it's kind of more highlights that are really, really interesting as opposed to the whole thing. Whereas the Roman Empire, the whole thing is endlessly fascinating and interesting to me. So then we move on to what? We've got the peak Roman age. We've got the late Roman age and the peak Roman age. They've been broken down into two. Well, in that case, I'm going to put the peak Roman age number one, and late Roman Age, number two. I thought that was 200 BC to 200 to 600 CE, but obviously it was 200 CE. So yeah, I'm going to just combine them both. In my opinion, I wouldn't really separate them, and I wouldn't. If I was going to separate Rome, I would never choose the date 200. I guess that's when the crisis of the first century happens, and maybe perhaps their argument starts to go downhill. But the empire certainly restored to its glorious height under Constantine and emperors like that. So I would, if you were going to pick a date to break up the Roman Empire and it's the Republic when it becomes the Republic to the Empire, that would be the date to divide it, in my opinion. But they've chosen 200 CE here. But anyway, I'm just going to put Rome number one, the peak Roman age. We'll put that number one. The late Roman age, number two. World War One is number four. World War Two is number four so far. Yeah, World War One was number three. World War Two, number four so far. Let's move on to some Hades, some Anani Dominis, or some C's, some modern era, the modern era, after Christ. Let's move on to after Christ. So we've got the early Middle Ages, and then we've got the late Middle Ages. So that's how they're breaking them down. We've got the early Middle Ages, which is 600 to 1000, the year 1000. If I was going to pick a date, I'd go 1066 as the early end of the early Middle Ages, but they've chosen 1000. That's fine, interesting date. It's the wrong date. You've chosen the wrong date on the tier list. But yeah, no. In terms of the early Middle Ages, I actually have studied this period a lot because you've got the formation of England, the formation of France, and many of the Christian Western states that we know today, the establishment of kings and the line of kings that still run to this day in like England and France. We get the beginnings of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, actually, the Holy Roman Empire is in full swing by the year 1000. Yeah, it's a very interesting period. It's basically the period where the move from the end of the Roman Empire to more of it becomes strongman rule over area that he can control, and that is kind of the beginnings of feudalism, the idea of vassals and lords and knights. But I guess that's kind of just beginning in this period. That full what we think of the Middle Ages, that's in the later Middle Ages. Of course, also in the early Middle Ages, we've got one of the most fascinating periods, the Viking Age, which is immensely fascinating from 793 to 1066. But the Vikings went everywhere, obviously establishing the Danelaw in England, complete control of Normandy in northern France, eventually heading down to Sicily, having taken over there for a little bit of time, and obviously becoming very involved in the Byzantine Empire as well, and even discovering America, I believe, around this age. So the early Middle Ages is, again, I know a lot about it. It's very interesting, but what I'd say about the early Middle Ages is kind of it's not in the full swing. Like, we're not into the kings and queens that you really know a lot about in terms of English and French history that I know particularly a lot about. We've got very good kings like Charlemagne in Alfred the Great in this period, but it's not the full medieval experience and level of interest that I'd have. I find the later medieval kings much more interesting, and probably because this is obviously a Dark Ages. It was referred to as the Dark Ages a lot, and we moved away from that term. Historians have recently. So obviously, it being a Dark Ages, it doesn't have as many sources that we can draw upon to learn about. Few exceptions in that, obviously, like Charlemagne's court. I really find this period interesting. I don't know if other people find it as interesting. For now, I'm just going to put it in some interest, not quite in the top tier. The late Middle Ages is going to go ahead of that because it's a slightly more interesting period for me. The later Middle Ages, obviously, we've got the establishment of we have the Norman conquest and the establishment of the line of kings that you probably are well familiar with: William I, William Rufus II, Henry I. Then we have a bit of an anarchy, but yeah, that line of kings, the classical medieval period of knights, chivalric order, crusades, the Knights Hospitaller. Of course, we've got the Byzantine Empire being slowly chipped away by the Ottomans during this period. Eventually, its complete collapse, obviously in 1453, which is definitely the end of the Middle Ages, in my opinion. Yeah, it's a very interesting period of history. There's lots to delve, and I think you could just study this period of history for your entire life, and you'd probably know about a quarter of what was going on in the world at that time. Of course, what I know of this period is a bit European focused, but I'd love to know more about what was going on in the world. Of course, we have the Mansa Musa, his kingdom in Africa, Mali, the Mali kingdom, him going on pilgrimage to Mecca. That's also going on in this period. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff going on in the world at that time. So I'm going to put that there. It's number 5 so far on my tier list ranking. Then we go to, I guess, we go to the age of exploration, they're calling it, or the Renaissance. Now, you could argue the Renaissance really kicked off in the 1350s under Petrarch, so it'd been well underway for a good while. But when we talk about the Renaissance, we often talk about a Southern Renaissance and a Northern Renaissance. The Southern Renaissance taking place earlier than the Northern Renaissance, which happens slightly later in the North. You've obviously got the beginnings of, well, a lot of things going on in the Age of Exploration. Now, the Age of Exploration, I'd say, is something that I know little. I don't know a lot about. I haven't studied it in terms of, I haven't had a class that was specifically dedicated to it. I know a little bit about it. I know, of course, about Magellan and some of the great explorers of that time, Francis Drake. Obviously, then we had Columbus discovering America and the unbelievable ramifications that had for the rest of history, the rest of time during the Age of Exploration. And then, of course, you've got the Renaissance, which is an explosion of art, culture, art that still interests and fascinates us to this day. No offense to medieval artists, but it's pathetic and laughable compared to, no, actually, offense is meant to medieval artists. Jesus Christ, you've got nothing on these guys. The painting of the 16th chapel. Yeah, I'd say that this period of history is immensely fascinating, but I don't know a huge amount about it. Immensely fascinating. You've got the beginnings of the British Empire. You've got the formation of the East India Trading Company. You've got formation of the 13 colonies being founded in Jamestown in 1607. You've got witch trials, you've got the Reformation, you've got Henry VIII, you've got enough. As I say, you could spend your entire life studying just this period alone. So yeah, I'd say this period is probably even more interesting to me than the later Middle Ages. Just again, in my own personal interest, because I probably know more about the early and late Middle Ages, but I'd say this period of history is something that I'm kind of learning more about. And as I said, there's so much going on in the world at this time. It's the beginning of an interconnected world, really. Absolutely, you could argue, and the beginnings of the worldwide trading system that we have today. So yeah, absolutely fascinating period of history. I'm going to put that really high up. Then we get the Westphalia period. That was obviously the Treaty of Westphalia, which happened in 1648, I believe, around that time anyway. That's the dates they've given. That was the period when we ended the 80 Years' War, which was the Dutch Revolt, which I'm actually reading about as we speak. That was 80 years worth of war. Then we also have the 30 Years' War. Lots of religious wars going on in this period, in the early period especially. And then we get the Westphalia Truce or period. Basically, we had a period where we have a peace concluded in Westphalia where we have the beginnings of a nation state and the recognition that a nation state has the right to exist and has a right to choose its own religious preference, Protestant or Catholic as it was at the time, and each nation has a right to decide that for itself, and it shouldn't be forced on it. What I would say is this is the period when you have swords and guns in battles. We have a lot going on, especially in the 1700s. Of course, then we get the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the Enlightenment period. It's called in the 1700s. You get the first mass manufacturing of products, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution taking place in my home, Northern England. Yay, we did something. So yeah, we've got a lot of stuff going on, like the previous period, but I've never found the 1700s and the late 1600s as interesting. I don't know as much about them as well. I know we've got like the Glorious Revolution, the beginning of prime ministers in the UK. Then we get the Georgian kings coming over from Hanover. They're being chosen because they were the next Protestant king in line. And the Enlightenment ideas going on. We've got people like Voltaire in France, and then you get the French Revolution towards the end. So I'd say a lot more, and the Napoleonic Wars. Completely, of course, this goes all the way up to 1815, and I find the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution, that late period in this particular period very interesting. But the earlier stuff, as I say, the late 17th century, the early 18th century, it's just not as interesting for me. I don't know as much about it. So I'm definitely ranking that lower than the last one. I'm going to put it just above the early Middle Ages because of the Napoleonic Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars are deeply fascinating, really interesting. I'm trying to learn a lot more about it, which brings me on to the Pax Britannia, I guess is what I'd call it, or the Victorian Age, 1815 to 1914, just before World War One. Yeah, this period is incredibly interesting. It is an explosion in technology. You get cameras, photography, obviously telegraph system, which managed to create instant communication between nations. This is the height of the British Empire and the British dominance, I guess you'd say, of the world the trading routes of the world. We had people like Palmerston's gunboat diplomacy, which was basically he'd rock up to any country that wasn't doing what we wanted, and he'd just blast it to kingdom come until it did. And that worked very well for Britain. You've got the rediscovery of Egypt happening in this period. Lots of fascination with Egypt just after Napoleon came back with the Rosetta Stone, and they managed to be able to read and understand a lot of that stuff. Yeah, this period is really interesting. What I would say is it's not got as many, because it's such a period of British dominance. And it's kind of an unchallenged dominance. Obviously, towards the end, you've got the growing threat of Germany and the unification of Germany. There's not a lot. It's kind of like a lot of foreboding towards World War One, as opposed to an event like World War One happening in this period. There's no massive wars like that happening in this period. We've got the Crimean War and the charging of the Light Brigade, but that's kind of the biggest war going on between the European powers. Obviously, this is the century of humiliation for China. We've got the Opium Wars, where Britain basically became the world's largest drug dealer and made a lot of money selling drugs. Who'd have thought that would work? So yeah, I guess the technology and the culture and the scientific age going on in this period, it's unmatched pretty much in any other period in almost human history. For me, there's not as many of them really interesting, really climactic events happening in this period, so I'm not going to rank it as high. Where are we? Would I rank it higher than the I would rank it higher than the Westphalia period, definitely higher than that. Probably wouldn't rank it higher than the late Middle Ages. It's around the same, but I'm probably going to lean that I prefer the later Middle Ages over this period. But again, I could talk forever about this period. It is really interesting and a lot going on. That's why I ranked it so high. We've all got three left, people. We're running out. So obviously I did the World War One and World War Two straight away, which would put the interwar period as the next period. Now this is probably I believe, yeah, it's the shortest period out of all of these periods highlighted, but I do think it is worthy of a separate period being classified as separate. Yeah, I'd say in the interwar period you've got a lot of culture going on, a lot of the early movies and industry going on. I like the early 1930s movies. I was watching a film just the other day from the 1930s. I Am a Fugitive with Paul, someone. Anyway, I watched lots of good early Hollywood is kicking off at this point. As a guy who likes old movies, that's pretty cool for me. You got FDR, who is probably in my opinion, the greatest ever American president. You've got the Wall Street crash in 1929. You've got the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. Again, for cultural history, this is really a lot going on and a really interesting, fascinating period of history. Of course, this is kind of in this period we see a lot of the post World War One world and dealing with that, and then the building up to World War Two and the fear by a lot of the politicians of not wanting to go back to a World War One. You got people like Chamberlain, who's obviously appeasement, the period of appeasement with Adolf Hitler. So yeah, a lot going on cultural history wise, a lot going on events wise, but again, it's kind of like build up to the big World War One, World War Two, the big event of World War Two when it all unleashes all that built up tension, kind of like the unleash of tension in World War One. So I would rank the interwar period. It's important. I know a lot about it. It's interesting, but it's just nowhere near as interesting as actually World War One and World War Two. So would I rank it? So it's definitely behind them. For me, it's behind the Age of Exploration. It's probably around here for me. It's either in front of the Pax Britannia age, or it's just behind it. In fact, I'm going to put it just behind the Pax Britannia age and just in front of the Westphalian period. That's where I'm going to rank it, which brings us down to two. Only two more to go. And if you notice, I'm ranking all of them quite high. There's no period in history that I find outright boring, to be honest. So yep, that's why I'm not ranking any really low down. We'll go on to the Cold War. That's the period just after World War II, all the way till the collapse of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day in 1991. But they've given the date of 1990 here. I guess that's when, just after the Berlin Wall had collapsed, and the game was obviously up for the Soviet Union by that point. The Cold War is actually one of the periods I studied for A-level history, and I would say I know a lot about it. One of my favorite presidents, John F. Kennedy, was basically at the height of the Cold War, got the Cuban Missile Crisis, lots of things that happened in the Cold War that inform the modern world. Obviously, it kicks off with the end of World War II and the Truman Doctrine and the building and dropping of the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then the second the USSR became a nuclear power as well, that meant we was heading for a new type of warfare, because you couldn't just have an outright war between the USSR and the Americans. So it became a war of hearts and minds, as they called it at the time. What I would say about the Cold War is there's periods where it gets hot in the early 60s and then it gets cool again. Rapprochement, I believe, in the early 70s. Nixon opening up communications in China, and that's a much more cooler period of the Cold War. And then obviously it ramps up again in the early 80s under the presidentship of Ronald Reagan, called the USSR, the Evil Empire. And he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I would say there's periods in the Cold War which are much more interesting than the overall picture of the Cold War. The earlier period with the McCarthy scare, I find that period fascinating and interesting, because it's interesting to see how America kind of turned in on itself through the fear of communism, and it was ready to throw away freedom for a lot of US citizens. Obviously, you get the blacklisting of not even communists, people who were just maybe slightly left wing, but then they've completely had their career blacklisted. So yeah, you can see the panic that was going on, an understandable panic, because America was facing an existential threat. The world was facing an existential threat in that early 50s, 60s period. A lot of kids grew up with the duck and cover method in case there was a nuclear war, and it was a daily part of people's lives. So yeah, I know a lot about the Cold War. It is a really interesting period in history, but it's just nowhere near as interesting again as World War II, World War One, the Roman Empire. It's not as interesting as the Age of Exploration, the Renaissance. It's probably around the same interest for me as the Middle Ages, in terms of how much I know about it, in terms of how interesting I find it. So yeah, that's probably where I would put that. Which brings us down to the last one, the internet age. I don't know if that's what historians will call this period, but that's what they've decided to call this period. The internet age. Oh, it's just short into I don't know anything about it, but I do know something about it. I've lived it. Yeah, it's hard to rank periods like the modern, like it's hard to rank modern presidents and judge them in comparison to presidents like 20, 30 years ago. I think after 20, 30 years, you've got a better understanding of their legacy and impact on the American people. But you can't really judge that in the immediate. But obviously, major events that happened during this period, you got 9/11, the War on Terror. It's probably the biggest period. The 2008 financial crash we're still dealing with. And then the 2020 pandemic. I mean, all of these periods, I mean, like the 2020 pandemic, I didn't even mention the 1917 flu, which happened in just after World War One in the interwar period. Well, that's just, I'd say the Spanish flu that happened then was much more impactful and important than the 2020 pandemic, but maybe I'm wrong. But as I say, that's a lot going on, but it's very hard to judge in the immediate. So for me, it's kind of, I'm going to put it at, I have little interest at the moment or a mediocre interest. I'll probably put it there at the moment, but obviously that'll change. Maybe when we're out of the present age, maybe there'll be a cut-off point where they'll say it was the internet age up until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a period of history. If when I live till I'm 100 years old, I'll be able to look back and reflect on that a lot different than I do now. But at this present time, I mean, it's very hard to judge it and learn about it because it's just too immediate for me. So for me, that's why I'm ranking it so low. And that's it. That's me done. I've ranked all of my periods of history. And again, this is just my own personal knowledge, my own personal interest. Not meaning any offense to people who are really, really big into their Middle Age bronze history. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. But at number one, we have got the peak Roman Empire. I mean, how could it be anything else? Number two, we've got the later Roman age, then World War One, then World War Two, then the Age of Exploration, the Renaissance, the later Middle Ages, the Cold War, the Congress of Vienna period or the Pax Britannia period, the Interwar period, the post-Westphalian period, then the early Middle Ages, and then towards the bottom, we've got the Stone Age, the late Bronze Age, the Classical Greek Age, the early Bronze Age, and the Middle Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and the Internet Age at the bottom. So that's my rankings. Let me know how you perhaps should have ranked them below, and let me know what you think of my particular choices, and let me know if you think I'm missing something. Perhaps there was something more about the Iron Age that I'm missing. Yeah, just let me know if you'd have ranked something a lot different from me. And yeah, until next time, thank you for watching. And yeah, I'll catch you on the next video.